Yeah, it bothers me a lot that you want to broadcast that you're associating with black people. You could sleep with them, you could bring them in, you could do whatever you want. The little I ask you is not to promote it on that and not to bring them to my games.
You guys will honestly not believe some of the most wildly racist remarks uttered by NBA players and staff. Unfortunately, there have been far too many incidents involving racism in the history of the NBA, and this video doesn't even include fans. I'm pretty sure fans have also said some wildly racist things during games, but this video will focus on NBA players and staff who just didn't really think about what they were saying. From a ridiculous ESPN headline to a commentator claiming somebody had a watermelon grin, these are some of the most racist events in NBA history. And sadly, there are far more incidents that didn't end up making the list, but were just as bad. Surprisingly enough, Shaquille O'Neal kicks off our video because he said something disturbing directed at Yao Ming back in his playing days with the Los Angeles Lakers. Back in 2003, the topic of Yao Ming was brought up to Shaq, and he laughed and said, "Tell Yao Ming, ching chong yang wa aso." While obviously Shaq was joking, these comments were met with very harsh criticism, and for good reason, though Ming was one of the few that didn't get offended by the joke and rather took the opportunity to educate Shaq on the matter instead. He informed Shaq about the many cultural boundaries that there are, and that his comments definitely crossed one of them, even saying that he knew Shaq was joking, but there were many Asian people out there that just don't understand his comments being a joke. Ming is correct in that statement as well. Even though something is intended as a joke in the moment, you never have any idea how those comments can make people feel who don't understand the relationship that the two men have for one another. Thankfully, this incident didn't end up being that serious, as there were apologies and a mutual understanding for either side to get everything sorted out and to never have this happen again.
Wang Zhu, whatever your name is, you want some of Shaq food? Come get it. I'll be waiting for you.
But there have been much worse incidents in NBA history. Like this one surrounding Jason Williams, which honestly was one of the worst racist incidents in league history. Williams was known as white chocolate throughout his time in the NBA. He was known for excellent passes and was always a thrill to watch play the game of basketball before he suffered one too many injuries. During his time with the Sacramento Kings in 2001, he was being heckled incredibly bad by a Golden State Warriors fan throughout the game. It got to the point where he had had enough and unleashed onto the fan, saying, "I will shoot all you Asian mother. Do you remember the Vietnam War? I'll kill y'all just like that." Now, you might think that that situation couldn't possibly get any worse than that, but you'd be wrong. It was reported that the fan in the stands, Michael Ching, was called multiple other homophobic slurs and further ignited the argument between the two men. Somebody reported that the argument between the two first began when Ching yelled, "Get used to sitting on the bench." And hey, maybe the fan did deserve some backlash for those comments, but in no way did he deserve to get racist remarks thrown his direction during the middle of the game, especially when those remarks include death threats and references to the Vietnam War, an incident that shouldn't ever be joked about. Understandably, Williams was plastered all over news headlines for this incident, and rightfully so. This type of behavior should not be tolerated, and he needed to be held accountable. Ching felt that way too, saying he needs to be held accountable. If he's not going to apologize, people need to know that too. That's more important than any fine or suspension by the NBA. Now, Danny Ferry was not given a fine or suspension. Instead, he was blackballed by the entire NBA community after comments made during a team meeting back in 2014. He was the general manager for the Atlanta Hawks, and the team was in deep discussions to sign free agent Luol Deng to the team, but weren't sure if he was a nice fit for them. Right in the middle of the meeting, Ferry decided to whip out a scouting report that was handed to him, and he read the entire thing. The only problem with that is what was on that scouting report. It said, "He's a good guy on the cover, but he's an African. He says what you like to hear, but behind closed doors, he could be killing you. Khan isn't bad, but it's there. African-like. Storefront looks great, but there's a black market section in the back." When looking back at the situation, it's kind of apparent that the incident was really the fault of the scout who decided to write this report and then hand it over to the general manager. But it wasn't treated that way. Ferry was under fire for not censoring what he was clearly reading during the meeting, which is understandable because he still chose to read that out loud to the team after seeing it was definitely racist. This prompted an entire investigation into the situation, and everybody came to the conclusion that Ferry was in fact the furthest thing from racist, and from my perspective, I don't think he was trying to be at all. However, that fact hasn't saved him from being completely blackballed in the community, and he has yet to pick up a consistent job since that moment. Although the bigger question is whether or not that scout was fired for his actions, because if he wasn't, then the Hawks may have bigger issues at hand here.
He's a good guy overall, but he's not perfect. He's not an African. And I don't say that in a bad way other than cut out front that's beautiful and great, but he may be selling some counterfeit stuff behind you.
And while this next incident doesn't involve the Hawks, it does highlight Donald Sterling, one of the more openly racist people in the world. He was the Los Angeles Clippers general manager for a long 22 years, and in that time span, he made quite a few enemies, namely Elgin Baylor. First of all, he purposefully underpaid Baylor even though he was a fantastic player, and then decided that he was going to freeze his contract at just $350,000 a year, all the while paying a white coach, Mike Dunleavy, over $20 million annually. Baylor ended up filing a lawsuit against the general manager back in 2008, and surprisingly, it wasn't even about his contract or salary, but rather his ongoing racist attitude as described in the suit. Baylor went on to mention how Sterling had visions of a southern plantation-type structure for the Clippers franchise, and that he was very persuasive with other members and staff with his racist attitude. Baylor said that Sterling was hoping to create a roster that was full of poor black boys from the South to go along with a white head coach. It was also mentioned in the suit that Sterling told Baylor's agent Danny Manning, "I'm offering you a lot of money for a poor black kid." Looking back on all this information, it's really shocking that he was able to keep his job for so many years. I mean, all this information came out, and yet he still lasted as the GM for a few more years. This guy was about as openly racist as you can imagine, and yet he didn't suffer nearly the consequences that he should have faced throughout his time in the NBA. Even his final remarks as the general manager for the Clippers were ridiculously racist. He had this to say before finally getting dismissed from the team. "It bothers me a lot that you want to broadcast that you're associating with black people. Do you have to? You can sleep with them, you can bring them in, you can do whatever you want. The little I ask is not to promote it on that and not to bring them to my games." Once again, it's devastating that somebody in a position of power, or really anybody for that matter, could be so racist in so many ways. It just doesn't make sense to me, and all I can say is thank goodness he was replaced with Steve Ballmer. This next incident took place back in 1981 and involves Rick Barry. While people's opinions on racism were vastly different back then when compared to 2021, it still doesn't give Barry any kind of excuse to say what he said about Bill Russell. The two of them were calling a game while simultaneously looking back at a picture of Russell from the year 1956, with Barry claiming that Russell had a watermelon grin on his face.
I don't know, it looks like some fool over there with that big watermelon grin on the left.
Because it was a broadcast, it was on air, so you could literally see the anger, sadness, and frustration in Russell's eyes the second he heard his companion Rick Barry say something like that. Shortly after the incident, Barry did take to the media to formally apologize and understand what he said was wrong, but it still doesn't make up for it.
There you go. I don't know if he wants to. He doesn't even want these. Bill. No, I don't want them.
Barry didn't have to live through the same laws and regulations that Russell did. And plus, attributing Russell to a basic stereotype is the same as stating how his outfit would look good in a KFC. This stuff just shouldn't ever be said, and even though it's good he apologized, he should have thought harder about what it was he was going to say before just saying it out loud. Kind of like how former ESPN editor Anthony Federico should have put more thought into his final headline that ended up getting him fired. The New York Knicks were on a roll that year behind Jeremy Lin and Linsanity, so when they finally suffered their first loss, it was a pretty big deal. Federico titled the headline, "Chink in the Armor," though he didn't realize the connection it had with Lin and the fact that he turned the ball over 9 times in the loss. Federico was deeply sorry for his actions and genuinely wasn't even thinking about the racist remark, but rather mentioning how the team was stopped in their tracks during a hot streak on the court. In my opinion, he just needed to be punished for that type of mistake though. He shouldn't have been completely removed from his position and fired. Especially when you realize that Max Britos, another employee for SportsCenter and ESPN News, had used literally the exact same term and yet was only given a 30-day suspension period before returning to work. Yes, Federico was wrong with that headline, but it was a genuine mistake that wasn't intentional. Maybe there was some other racism going around ESPN that we didn't even know about, but I digress. Check out the terrifying times that NBA players actually fight fans.